In 1859, a 19-year-old bookkeeper was fired from his job for asking for a raise. He walked out with nothing but a notebook full of numbers and a promise that he would never again depend on another man's approval to survive. He wasn't greedy. He wasn't reckless. He had simply done the math, the way he always did, and calculated that his work was worth $800 a year instead of $600. His employer refused. So the young man did something almost no one in his position would have dared to do in 1859. He quit. He walked out of that office with no savings to speak of, no family fortune behind him, and no plan beyond a small leather notebook where he had spent years tracking every cent he had ever earned or spent. What he carried with him instead was a conviction that would define the rest of his life. He would never again let his future depend on someone else's permission. That teenager's name was John Davison Rockefeller. Within 40 years, he would control roughly 90% of all the oil refined in the United States. He would become the richest man the world had ever seen, a fortune so large that, adjusted for the size of the American economy today, no one has ever matched it since. Not Carnegie, not Gates, not Bezos, not Musk. And yet almost no one who hears his name today truly understands how it happened. How does a quiet, meticulous, almost invisible young clerk, a man with no dramatic speeches, no flashy inventions, no single stroke of genius anyone could point to, become the most feared and most admired businessman in American history? This is not a story about luck. It is not a story about inheritance. It is a story about discipline so extreme it bordered on obsession, patience so total it unnerved the people around him, and a mind that looked at the most chaotic, wasteful industry in America and saw, where everyone else saw a gold rush, an opportunity to impose order. By the end of this story, you will understand something most people never learn from the history books, that empires are rarely built by the boldest men in the room. They are built by the most patient ones, and sometimes the price of that patience is a legacy that history can never fully agree on. Hero to some, villain to others, and something far more complicated than either to anyone who looks closely enough. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in a small farmhouse near Richford, in upstate New York, into a household that offered him no stability at all. His father, William Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman, though salesman barely captures what he actually was. Locally, people called him Big Bill, and he was, by most honest accounts, something closer to a con man. He sold fake medicine out of the back of a horse-drawn wagon, claiming bottles of colored liquid could cure cancer. He disappeared from home for months at a time, sometimes returning with money, sometimes returning with nothing but excuses. Years later, it was discovered that he had secretly married a second woman under a completely false name, while still legally married to John's mother. He lived a double life so complete that even his own children didn't fully understand who their father was until much later. Eliza Rockefeller, John's mother, was the opposite of her husband in almost every conceivable way: devout, frugal, disciplined, and unshakably strict. She raised 6 children largely alone, stretching every dollar Bill occasionally sent home to cover months of absence, and she taught young John a phrase he would repeat, almost like a prayer, for the rest of his life. Willful waste makes woeful want. It wasn't just a saying to her, it was survival. It is impossible to overstate how much this childhood shaped the man John Rockefeller became. He grew up watching his father charm strangers out of their money with confident smiles and empty promises, then vanish before the consequences arrived. He grew up watching his mother hold together a household through nothing but sheer discipline, keeping a roof over 6 children's heads with a fraction of what a stable income would have provided. From one parent, he learned exactly how easily people could be persuaded, flattered, and misled. From the other, he learned that the only real security in life came from control. Control over money, over time, over risk, over every variable that could be measured and managed. By the time he was a young teenager, Rockefeller was already unlike the other boys around him. He didn't dream of adventure, and he showed almost no interest in the games or ambitions that occupied his peers. Instead, he kept a small ledger book he proudly called Ledger A, recording every cent he earned and spent, down to the smallest transaction. Hauling wood for neighbors, raising turkeys, and selling them at a profit, even lending small sums of money to other children at interest. At the age of 7, he sold a bag of candy his mother had given him to his siblings, piece by piece, for a profit. It wasn't cruelty. It was instinct. He gave a strict portion of every dollar he earned to his church without fail, a habit that began in childhood and never once broke, even decades later, when his weekly income had grown from a few dollars into millions. Numbers, to young Rockefeller, weren't simply arithmetic. They were the one part of life that never lied to him, never abandoned him, and never pretended to be something they weren't. In a household defined by his father's deception, the ledger book became the closest thing John had to a source of truth. At 16, with the family's finances as unstable as ever, he set out to find real employment in Cleveland, Ohio. For 6 long weeks, he walked from business to business in a single plain black suit, applying at every trading house, bank, and shipping company he could find, and being turned away again and again. He later described walking the same streets day after day, refusing to give up, refusing to lower his standards for the kind of company he wanted to work for, even as rejection piled on rejection. On September 26, 1855, a date he remembered with more emotion for the rest of his life than almost any other, including the day he became a millionaire. He was finally hired as an assistant bookkeeper at a small produce shipping firm called Hewitt & Tuttle for 50 cents a day. He later said that day meant more to him than nearly any other milestone of his career, because that day proved something he had begun to suspect but had never had the chance to confirm: that a boy with no money, no family name, and no advantages could still build something real if he was simply more careful, more exact, and more relentless than everyone else in the room. For 3 years, Rockefeller buried himself in the bookkeeping trade, learning the shipping and produce business from the inside out: freight costs, commissions, insurance rates, the tiny margins that separated a profitable shipment from a losing one. He impressed his employers so quickly that within a year he was handling responsibilities far beyond his age, and his salary climbed steadily. But even as he rose, something about working for other men gnawed at him. He had watched his father spend a lifetime answering to no one, for better or worse, and some part of that restlessness had clearly passed down to the son, even though John despised almost everything else about William Rockefeller's character. At 20 years old, he did something almost no one in his position was expected to do. He left the security of steady employment behind, and, with a loan of $1,000 from his father, issued at a strict interest rate, because even family didn't receive generosity from William Rockefeller, he started his own commodities trading firm with a partner named Maurice Clerk. The company, Clerk and Rockefeller, traded in grain, meat, and other produce moving through Cleveland's busy port, and it grew steadily through the difficult years of the American Civil War, when demand for provisions soared and careful, disciplined operators could make real money supplying the war effort. But it was what happened just a short distance from Cleveland in the early 1860s that would change the entire trajectory of Rockefeller's life, and eventually the trajectory of American industry itself. In 1859, oil had been discovered in western Pennsylvania at a well drilled by a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake. Within a few short years, the region exploded into a chaotic, lawless gold rush. Except instead of gold, prospectors were drilling for what they called rock oil, a thick, foul-smelling substance that could be refined into kerosene for lamps at a time when whale oil was becoming scarce and expensive. Wooden derricks sprang up overnight across the hillsides. Fortunes were made and lost within weeks. Towns with names like Pithole, Pennsylvania, grew from open farmland to a population of 15,000 people in a matter of months, complete with hotels, saloons, and its own post office, and then collapsed into a ghost town almost as quickly once the local wells ran dry. Most businessmen who entered the oil rush were gamblers at heart, chasing the thrill and danger of the strike, the drama of watching a new well erupt and knowing in an instant whether they were suddenly rich or suddenly ruined. Rockefeller traveled to the oil region himself to see it firsthand, and he came away utterly unimpressed, not because the opportunity wasn't real, but because almost everyone around him was pursuing it the wrong way. He looked at the same industry and saw something almost nobody else did. Chaos. Wasteful, undisciplined, unpredictable chaos. Wells were being drilled with no coordination whatsoever, often draining each other dry through sheer competitive recklessness. Refineries were popping up with no standardization, no consistent quality, no safety practices. Prices for crude oil swung wildly from week to week, sometimes collapsing by more than half in a matter of days. Fortunes were made by luck, and destroyed by luck just as quickly. Rockefeller had no interest in luck. He had grown up despising the unpredictability his father represented, and gambling on a hole in the ground struck him as precisely the kind of undisciplined thinking that had made his childhood so unstable. So while other men rushed toward the drilling fields, hoping to strike it rich by pulling crude oil directly out of the earth, Rockefeller made a decision that seemed almost boring by comparison, a decision so quiet and unglamorous that hardly anyone at the time recognized its significance. It would prove to be one of the most important business decisions in the history of American industry. He would not drill for oil. He would refine it. It was not glamorous work. Refining at the time was filthy, dangerous, and inefficient, a business most respectable investors avoided. But Rockefeller approached it the same way he had approached his ledger books as a teenager, with obsessive attention to waste. He hired a chemist to figure out how to extract more usable products from every barrel of crude oil. He calculated, down to the drop, how many soldering drops it took to seal a can of kerosene. And when he discovered his workers were using 40 drops per can, he ordered it reduced to 39. That single change saved the company an enormous amount of money over time, Because Rockefeller understood something almost nobody else in American business understood yet. In a business built on razor-thin margins, saving a fraction of a cent, multiplied by millions of transactions, was worth more than any single lucky oil strike. By 1865, at just 25 years old, Rockefeller bought out his original partners in a tense, high-stakes auction where the two men bid against each other for control of the company. And Rockefeller won, later calling it the most important day of his business life. 5 years later, in 1870, he formally founded the Standard Oil Company, with a name chosen deliberately. Standard was meant to promise something the chaotic oil industry had never reliably offered before: consistent, dependable, standardized quality, at a time when kerosene lamps of poor quality fuel were known to explode in people's homes and burn them alive. Rockefeller wanted his product associated with safety and trust, at a moment when trust was in desperately short supply in the oil business. And it was here that Rockefeller revealed the second half of his genius, a half that would make him both the most powerful businessman in American history and one of its most controversial figures for generations to come. He understood that surviving the oil business wasn't only about efficiency inside your own refinery. It was about control over the entire chain surrounding it. The crude oil that fed the refinery, the railroads that shipped the finished product, and eventually, the competitors who threatened to undercut him. The oil industry of the 1870s was a brutal, unpredictable war zone. Refiners undercut each other into bankruptcy on a regular basis. Railroads charged wildly different rates to different companies, often based on backroom deals, favoritism, and outright bribery, with no transparency at all. Rockefeller looked at this landscape and made a decision that would define the rest of his career. If the industry itself was chaos, then Standard Oil would simply absorb the chaos. One refinery, one railroad contract, one competitor at a time, until there was no chaos left to absorb. He began by approaching the three major railroads competing for oil shipments out of Cleveland, and instead of letting them play refiners against each other, he offered each railroad something no one else could: guaranteed, massive, predictable shipping volume in exchange for secret rebates, discounted freight rates far below what any competitor was paying. In some arrangements, Standard Oil even received a rebate on the shipments of its rivals, meaning Rockefeller was quietly profiting every time a competitor's oil left the state. With those advantages, Standard Oil could price its kerosene below what smaller refiners paid just for shipping alone, forcing them to sell at a loss on every single barrel or shut down entirely. Then, once a competitor was cornered, Rockefeller would approach them personally, calmly, without anger, almost gently, according to multiple accounts from men who sat across the table from him. He would lay out their financial position with unnerving precision, often knowing more about their own costs than they did, and offer to buy them out. Those who agreed usually walked away with Standard Oil stock that, within a decade, made many of them wealthier than they ever expected to be. Those who refused usually went bankrupt within a year or two, and Standard Oil bought their refineries for a fraction of their worth anyway, once the bank foreclosed. In February of 1872, in a campaign that later became known as the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller moved with terrifying speed, meeting with rival refiner after rival refiner over the course of just a few weeks. By the end of that single month, he had absorbed 22 of his 26 competitors in the city of Cleveland alone. Some later described the sensation of negotiating with him as being told, calmly and without malice, that resistance was simply a mathematical error, that the numbers had already decided the outcome before the conversation even began. From there, the pattern repeated itself across Pennsylvania, New York, and beyond, refinery by refinery, region by region, for the rest of the decade. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled an almost unimaginable 90% of all oil refined in the entire United States. A single company, run by a man not yet 41 years old, now controlled the fuel that lit nearly every American home after sundown. This was the turning point of Rockefeller's story. Not one dramatic moment, but a relentless, methodical campaign of acquisitions, negotiations, and calculated pressure that transformed a chaotic frontier industry into the first true monopoly in American history. And it forced the country to confront a question it had never seriously had to ask before. What happens when one man controls something the entire nation depends on to see in the dark? Because by the 1880s, Standard Oil wasn't simply the largest oil company in America. It effectively was the American oil industry. It set prices. It dictated terms to railroads that had once dictated terms to everyone else. It could make or destroy a rival business with a single decision made quietly in a Cleveland office. And that kind of power inevitably attracted enemies, powerful ones, patient ones, and eventually ones who would prove far more dangerous to Rockefeller's legacy than any business rival ever had been. Journalists began investigating Standard Oil's practices throughout the 1880s and 1890s, but it was one writer in particular who would permanently reshape how the American public saw John D. Rockefeller. Her name was Ida Tarbell, and her own father had been a small oil producer in Pennsylvania, whose business had been crushed decades earlier by the very tactics Standard Oil used to dominate the region. She spent years combing through court records, corporate filings, and first-hand interviews, building a devastating, meticulously researched exposé of the company's methods. Her reporting, published in serialized chapters between 1902 and 1904, painted Rockefeller not as a builder, but as a predator, a man who had crushed honest, hard-working competitors through secret railroad deals and calculated financial pressure, all while hiding behind a mask of quiet, church-going respectability on Sundays. The public reaction was fierce, and it arrived with a speed that stunned Rockefeller himself. A man who had once been admired as the ultimate self-made success story, proof that a poor bookkeeper's son could rise to the very top of American industry through nothing but discipline and hard work, became, almost overnight, one of the most hated men in the country. Cartoonists across the nation drew him as a grotesque octopus, its tentacles wrapped around the Capitol building in Washington, around state legislatures, around railroads, around entire towns. Preachers who once praised his generosity began condemning his methods from the pulpit. And in 1911, after years of exhausting legal battles that reached all the way to the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil had violated federal antitrust law and ordered the company broken apart into 34 separate independent companies. It should have been the humiliating end of Rockefeller's story, the collapse of an empire built, at least in part, on ruthlessness. Instead, something almost unbelievable happened. Because Rockefeller personally owned large blocks of stock in every single one of those 34 companies, And because the oil industry was about to explode in value with the sudden rise of the automobile across America, the court-ordered breakup of Standard Oil didn't destroy his fortune at all. It multiplied it, almost overnight, as the value of his scattered shares soared independently. Several of those 34 companies still exist today in some form, transformed over the following century into globally recognized names like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Amoco, and Marathon Petroleum. The government had broken up the empire. It had not broken the man who built it. But to understand Rockefeller only as a monopolist is to miss half of who he actually was. And it's important, here, to be honest, about the full complexity of this man, not to sand it down into either a hero or a villain. In 1864, Rockefeller married Laura Celestia Spellman, a woman as disciplined and devout as he was, whom friends nicknamed SETI. She had grown up in an abolitionist household that had reportedly hosted stops on the Underground Railroad, and she matched her husband's seriousness with a quiet strength of her own. Together, they raised 5 children in a household that, despite the family's staggering wealth, remained deliberately modest by the standards of America's Gilded Age elite. Rockefeller gave his children small allowances and required them to keep their own ledger books, tracking every penny earned and spent, just as he had done as a boy, insisting that wealth, unearned and unmanaged, could destroy a person faster than poverty ever could. From his very first paycheck at 16, Rockefeller had tithed a strict portion of his income to his church, a habit he never once broke, even as his earnings grew from a few dollars a week into millions of dollars a year. As he aged, and particularly after the ferocious public backlash against Standard Oil, he began redirecting an enormous share of his energy and his fortune into philanthropy on a scale the world had genuinely never seen before. Acting on the advice of a Baptist minister named Frederick Gates, who effectively became his philanthropic strategist, Rockefeller funded the creation of the University of Chicago in 1890, eventually contributing the equivalent of billions of dollars in today's money to build it into one of the finest research institutions in the world. In 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University, which would go on to produce numerous Nobel Prize winners. Through the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, he funded a sweeping campaign that helped eradicate hookworm disease across the American South, a parasite that had quietly sapped the strength and productivity of millions of poor rural Americans for generations. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, funded groundbreaking research into yellow fever, malaria, and countless other diseases, saving an almost incalculable number of lives across the 20th century, both in the United States and around the world. He also funded historically black colleges and universities across the American South, including Spelman College, named for his wife's family, at a time when very few wealthy white industrialists were willing to associate themselves publicly with such causes. By the end of his life, Rockefeller had given away more than $500 million, an amount that, adjusted for inflation and for the size of the American economy at the time, ranks among the largest personal philanthropic commitments in human history. He was, in other words, 2 men living inside one body. The coldly calculating businessman who showed no mercy to competitors standing between him and control of an industry, and the devout, disciplined son of a strict Baptist mother who genuinely believed that money was a solemn responsibility, never simply a reward to be enjoyed. He once explained his own philosophy in strikingly simple terms, that he believed his ability to make money was a gift, and that squandering it selfishly would have been the true sin, not the accumulation of it. Whether or not a modern audience finds that reasoning fully convincing, it was, by every available account, sincerely and deeply held, not a public relations performance staged after the fact. He was also, by nearly every personal account from those who knew him, a strangely quiet and unremarkable man to simply be around. He didn't drink alcohol. He didn't smoke. He rose early every single day of his adult life, worked with total uninterrupted focus for a set number of hours, and then returned home for simple, modest family dinners, largely uninterested in the extravagant mansions and lavish parties that defined so much of Gilded Age high society. He rarely raised his voice, even in the most heated business negotiations of his career. Colleagues and rivals alike described him as almost eerily calm under pressure, a man capable of negotiating the financial destruction of a rival company using the exact same, even unhurried tone he might use to discuss the weather outside his window. That calm was not the absence of ambition. It was ambition so completely mastered, so fully internalized, that it no longer needed to raise its voice to prove itself to anyone. In his later years, Rockefeller became almost as famous for his health regimen as he had once been for his business empire. Doctors had told him in his 50s, worn down by decades of stress and overwork, that he might not live much longer unless he dramatically changed his lifestyle. He responded the way he responded to everything, with discipline. He took up golf, played it daily well into his 90s, adopted a strict, carefully measured diet, and reportedly began giving away shiny dimes to strangers he met on the street and on golf courses, a small, almost playful habit that became one of the most talked about quirks of his final decades, and one that softened, at least slightly, the public's image of the man once drawn as a merciless octopus in the nation's newspapers. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at the age of 97, having outlived nearly every rival who had once called him a monster, and nearly every journalist who had once dedicated their career to bringing him down. By then, the world he had helped build, a world running on refined oil, on automobiles, on industrial-scale infrastructure stretching from coast to coast, had become simply the world everyone lived in, so completely and so thoroughly that few people even remembered how strange and chaotic the oil business had been before one quiet bookkeeper decided to impose order on it. His story does not offer a simple lesson. It is not a clean parable about hard work always being rewarded fairly, because Rockefeller's rise involved tactics that were, by any honest measure, ruthless. Secret railroad rebates, calculated financial pressure, and a level of market control that a modern legal system would never allow. Tactics that destroyed the livelihoods of men who had done nothing wrong except try to compete with him in an industry with no rules. But it is also not a simple story about greed, because the same man who crushed his rivals without visible hesitation spent nearly 40 years of his life building hospitals, funding universities, eradicating diseases, and quietly saving lives on a scale that few individuals in the entire history of the world have ever matched, before or since. Perhaps that is the real lesson buried inside the life of John D. Rockefeller. Not that ambition is simply good, And not that ambition is simply dangerous, but that ambition without any limit will always demand a reckoning of some kind, sooner or later, one way or another. He built one of the greatest personal fortunes the world has ever known, starting with nothing but a small leather ledger book and a quiet, unshakable promise to himself that he would never again be at the mercy of another man's decisions. And in the end, the boy who once tracked every single penny in a notebook by candlelight became the man who quietly redefined what an American fortune, and just as importantly, an American conscience, could actually look like. The refineries he built by hand are gone now. The company he founded was legally dismantled into pieces more than a century ago, its name erased from the map. But the world he shaped, a world of industrial scale, ruthless efficiency, and philanthropic ambition on a scale once thought impossible, is still, in more ways than most people realize, the exact world we wake up inside of every single day.